So I'm happy to present this webinar, Business Growth in a Water-Stressed World. We are joined by a series of speakers. So that would be my colleagues here, Colin Strong and Leah Schleifer from the Water Program, as well as one of our Aqueduct Alliance members, Emilia Tenuta. So we are excited to have their reflections and expertise today. But before I kick it off and hand it over to them, a little bit of housekeeping around this webinar platform here. So you are all muted upon entry, and I also encourage you to just use the local mute on your phone or computer as you're not speaking. But we do want to really encourage an engaging dialogue. So if you have questions at any point throughout the discussion and the presentations, there are about 3 ways that you can engage with us. There is a raise your hand feature built in on the webinar. So if you hit that, we'll then be able to call on you and make sure that you're unmuted. You can also type questions into that chat questions box so that we can know again to unmute you so that you can engage with the dialogue. And then finally, once you are unmuted, feel free to just jump right in and use your voice so you can speak those questions out. We're happy to engage in a really interactive way. So with that, without further ado, we'll pass it over to Leah first to give us a bit of a World Water Week recap. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Leah. Welcome to this webinar, like Emily said. So I'm going to kick it off by just giving a summary of what exactly World Water Week is and why WRI participated, and also how we participated at World Water Week, because although you're all interested in it, maybe you haven't heard of it before today, and maybe you haven't been before. So World Water Week is the annual focal point for the world's water issues. It's kind of like the COP of the water world. It's that one time a year when everyone critical in the community that can attends, comes together and talks about the most pressing water issues, new developments, new technologies, and paradigms that can shift the way we think about and use water. Each year there's a theme for the week, and this year it was wastewater, reduce and reuse. So WRI engaged in a few different ways through a few different panels. And by the way, I forgot to mention this, it's organized World Water Week by SIWI, which is the Stockholm International Water Institute. So WRI acts as a partner with them on certain events during the week and other organizations as well. So here on the slide, you can see a few of our events. These are 6 of them. We had about 12 total, and we had about 16 members of both the water and governance teams at WRI that attended. I just put these ones up because they are the most business relevant, so you can see some we had there that related to businesses' valuation of water, our water risk tools like Aqueduct, and the circular economy, which fit into the wastewater theme. So WRI engaged a lot on context-based water targets, which Colin's going to talk about. We also highlighted our sludge to energy work, which went along well with the year's wastewater theme, and you can see that in that middle top event that we had. We also talked a lot about natural infrastructure for water and engaging utilities and other investors in prioritizing natural landscapes for water quality. And then the Governance Center launched a report about water transparency in Indonesia, Mongolia, and Thailand, and in which they found that people in those countries who were poor did not know whether or not their water was polluted. So that was the main external release that we had there. Internally, we also had an event with our partners and funders about one of our upcoming new tools. So this is also a way for us to meet one-on-one and in private groups and have kind of updates with key stakeholders. So at this event, we talked about a new tool that's coming to the Aqueduct suite of tools next year. So yeah, that's a kind of quick summary of what World Water Week is and why it's an important time for us and the water world.
Awesome. Thank you, Leah. Before we move on to the next portion here, I thought maybe we could just do a quick poll. So either by chat or raising your hand, just to indicate if you did attend World Water Week, you could just let us know that through the chat. We'd be happy to add your insights into the discussion. And then meanwhile, I think we were able to connect with at least one person that we know attended. Emilio, we'd love to hear your reflections on kind of the highlights and your experience at World Water Week this year.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Awesome. Well, everyone, great to be online with you. As I'll just build on what Leah shared as her initial thoughts as we looked at Stockholm and the theme of wastewater. I will say that, we had an opportunity to also, again, this has been probably a few years in a row now that the UN CO water mandate was also had their endorser stakeholder meeting along with this great event in Stockholm. And so I got a chance to, work closely with some of our colleagues and some of our counterparts within other companies that are endorsing companies to the UN CO water mandate on this topic of wastewater, reduce and reuse and recycle. And it was good to hear them, understanding the challenges that they're faced with and how it intersects with what the major theme was for Stockholm. I think that as I dissect my, key takeaways, it really boils down to two for me as it impacts industry. First, I'll talk about this concept of rethink the water cycle. I think all of us know from a private sector perspective, as companies continue to seek to meet the demand that we have this finite supply of natural resources related to fresh water. And we continue, as business as usual, the global demand that we heard about loud and clear in many of the sessions was that, we've got this 40% gap by 2030. And that kept, being replayed over and over again. Another organization talked about it as each year, our demand continues to grow by 1% a year. And so you could see the challenge with doing things the same way we have been. Although companies are aware of this, obviously, and many have actively increased their water conservation efforts. A lot of them probably on the phone today. One of the factoids that came out of that point was that since 2011, corporate water use of these are the largest organizations around the world, have only declined water use by 10%. So unfortunately, that obviously is not enough to close the gap, and it's what keeps us up at night. And so this theme in Stockholm this year of, what I'll call untapping wastewater as a resource is a valued resource instead of thinking of it as, something we discard as a consumable good. Repurposing wastewater, there was a key stat that I thought was very interesting for all of you to hear, which was that I think it was Bank of America that I sourced it from, which did some work around wastewater, and that it only accounts for only 2.4% of all the freshwater use globally when it comes to reuse and reclaim, which is interesting, right? So if you think about the growing gap between freshwater supply and demand that we talked about, it really does speak to the emphasis that we need to have on rethinking our water cycle within our facilities, including the ones that Ecolab manages. We have about 120 around the world that I'm responsible from a water goal perspective, and finding ways to not only drive reduction or conservation strategies, but also reclaim and recycle technologies. I would say the second, I'll continue to my second key takeaway of the two. There was a lot of discussion from WRI and from a lot of very reputable organizations and industry around this taking what I call a bottom-up approach to corporate water goal setting based on catchment impacts. People refer to it as the context-based targeting approach. It's rapidly gaining traction in my mind from what I heard around Stockholm this year. It obviously has been introduced well over a year ago. I'm not sure it got a lot of traction at that time. I see the tides starting to turn on this for industry. The approach, obviously we've all taken, and Ecolab is no different. We've taken very much a top-down approach with corporate goal setting up to now that really has a peanut butter spread approach across all the watersheds that we operate in. And so the context-based approach, for those that aren't as familiar with it, recognizes that water management activities, there's really not a one-size-fits-all, and that we should account for basin-specific needs and address the root cause of the shared water challenges at that basin level. So, the idea is that more meaningful water targets are then developed and informed by an alignment with the collective needs of that broader community in that watershed of which we're all operating in. So I think businesses that use just my opinion, that businesses that use a context-based goal setting approach can make, I think, investments with greater confidence and reduce the risk strategies for business growth, especially as we look to grow in places where water is not as available or is challenged in terms of quality. So my takeaways, I think, from this particular area of focus, which is goal setting, I think the benefits to contextualizing these water goals at a basin level, obviously the ability to manage disruptive risk, which is aligned with, in my case, at Ecolab, our corporate water and business strategy. The second was the consideration of factors such as environmental, social, economic, and public perception of where we're operating. Incorporating some of the key elements of water stewardship. We're in process right now of getting 2 of our facilities in Southern California to be AWS Alliance for Water Stewardship certified. So this is very important to us. And then finally, the ability to prioritize corporate engagement in select locations where there's the greatest risk and impact to our growth. So I think I'll stop there just so that we can get others' reaction.
That's great. Thanks so much, Emilio. Before we jump into maybe questions from anyone on the line, Paul, is there anything you wanted to add there in terms of your reflections?
I agree very much with Emilio's view. There's a lot of interest in this notion of more meaningful corporate targets related to water to ensure that companies are actually driving positive change on the ground and reducing their risk through their target setting exercises, and it doesn't become something more of a legacy exercise, but rather something that's really impactful and meaningful. I think there was a lot of talk around that. I was very pleased to hear more talk and more conversations around the importance of the economic analysis underpinning the identification of solutions. And I was on a panel with folks from GE and Xylem and a utility out in California, and it was really great to hear and to really remind the audience that there's a lot of great ideas, but the economics have to work. So addressing kind of the issue of pricing and financing of water and water infrastructure, I think is at the core of what we're going to have to do moving forward. And I was very happy to see that surface as a main topic. And then the other is a growing appetite to shift the conversation from one of risk to one of growth, and one of business growth in a water constrained world. I mean, I feel, at least, maybe it's because I work on these topics all day, but we've been talking about risk for some time, and more companies understand the materiality of these issues, and there is now appetite to shift that and say, okay, well, given that we are operating and sourcing from places that face, stress and scarcity. What do we have to do to continue to grow our businesses successfully, right? So I think that shift in thinking and that shift in conversation is starting to happen, and is something that here at WRI for sure we're eager to pick up and run with over the coming year.
Can I just add to that, Paul?
You bet.
So a couple thoughts. You spurred some other thinking as I'm thinking about the 3 days we were there. One is I couldn't agree more on the business case. I think it actually speaks to the challenge that we've had, at least in my experience, with companies moving from a reduce to a reuse recycle perspective to really become more circular. I think the challenge is the fact that water continues to be undervalued, and I think there's an aspect of making it difficult to make that business case to really support action at a local level. The second is I want to go back to the context-based goals. I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Paul. I definitely feel this is early days, right? So, I shared my thoughts about what I liked about the context-based approch. But I will say there's early adopters that I consider beginning to evaluate the concept in select high-risk geographies. But there's still a lot more to do. So I don't want to give people this idea that there's a whole bunch of case studies that exist to support how one went about, developing this basin level analysis. I think for those that attended our session where Paul and I were together on this Rethink Water, Reinvent Business session that we had, that came out, I think, loud and clear in Paul's comments related to, there's still, I think one of the challenges with this context-based approach is obviously there's a lot of analysis that's needed at a basin level to really understand, the methods and the water quantity and quality challenges, as well as regulations that would support the thinking around goal setting at a local level. Now, I just want to make sure that people understand also the challenges, not just the opportunities. And so there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm because I think people feel it's the right direction. I do like Paul's point about growth as opposed to just focused on risk, because I think when we think of risk, it obviously becomes very reactionary as opposed to developing a very proactive water management strategy for your organization. So I just wanted to throw those key thoughts out, Paul, to what you said.
That's great. Yeah, yeah, completely agree.
Excellent. So as a reminder for everyone who is a participant on the line, if you'd like to ask questions throughout the presentation at any point or right now, please do enter those into the chat question box or use the raise hand feature, and we'll make sure you're unmuted to engage. But since I don't see any of those right now, let's move on. I think that's a good segue actually here from Emilio and Paul's comments around context-based water targets to then hear from Colin.
Great, thank you, Emily. So for those of you who are less experienced in terms of context-based water targets, and also to provide updates from Stockholm and in the CEO water mandate session that Emilio mentioned, I'm going to run through the context-based water targets and give an overview of sort of what they are with a little more depth, and also just kind of provide feedback and where this is going. So let's see, what are we doing? Okay, good, we're good on time. So to kind of lay the foundation, some of this work, not all of the context-based water targets, but some of it derives from earlier WRI work with MARS, and I think many of the CCG members are familiar with the MARS targets. And MARS and WRI work to set GHG, land use, and water targets, and the water targets somewhat took on a life of their own, have contributed and rolled into now this much bigger initiative of context-based water targets. So context-based water targets is one of the major priorities for the UN Global Compact and the CEO water mandate, and has been a major topic previous years, last year and this year, and will continue to be a major priority for the near foreseeable future. I should also mention that since I think we have a variety of audiences that have different levels of experience in terms of water stewardship, context-based water targets reflects what leading companies in a leading sector are doing on water stewardship. This is very much the front end of it. So Amelia pointed out that not everything has been figured out. There's definitely a lot more work to be done. And for those that are they may be intimidated by what I'm about to go into in a little more depth. It's not necessarily something that is for every company right now. It is something that is a sort of cutting edge tool and approach. So fundamentally, it's an approach to set targets that have a meaningful reduction in water risk, and ideally, and not be wasting time or energy or effort on without mitigating negative water-related impacts in basins. So I'll jump into this. Okay. This will have a quick overview of background and approach, the rationale behind context-based water targets, why businesses adopt them, and then the big themes that we got out of Stockholm. So for those that are not experienced with the context-based water targets world, I would make the analogy to science-based targets. So first of all, science-based targets demand a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in line and keeping with a global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. So the reason that the Science-Based Targets initiative is useful and compelling is that it establishes a science-based end target and a system of thresholds, and then it works its way back from there. So in this case, the science-based end target is the keeping global temperatures from increasing more than 2 degrees. Now, after that science-based end target has been established, then there's a system of allocations to understand that various industries and companies have some sort of contribution to GHG emissions, and then given an allocation, it allows companies to generate a corporate target to contribute their fair share of attempting to reduce emissions. So it really comes down to an end state that's scientifically based end state, and then using that to define what a corporate target looks at. And I think that's a very important framing of targets because that's exactly the same approach that context-based water targets takes. It's that consider the end state first and then work your way backwards to create corporate targets that effectively reach that desired end state. So unlike GHG, where a ton of carbon in the air is a ton of carbon in the air, and it doesn't matter where it came from, of course, we know fairly well that water tends to be very contextual. So returning stream flow in British Columbia versus returning stream flow in Southern California, one of them will have fairly significant effects to improve or mitigate water risk, and one of them will probably have no effect on the environment. So to truly understand water risk, it needs to be based in the basin. And I think that this is fairly well understood, even by those new to the water space, that everything needs to be contextually based. So I'll quickly add that another critical factor in the basin perspective is alignment with diverse stakeholders as opposed to just having singular action. And we'll come back to this point of aligning with diverse stakeholders later. And another one is aligning with public sector objectives as opposed to just having some corporate target that doesn't have some sort of larger strategic alignment. And again, we'll come back to both the public sector and the diverse stakeholders overall as we keep going. All right, so I think it's fair to say that contextual water targets have been around for a while, and a contextual water target could be some response to like a classic water analysis that WR has done many times before. For example, making water efficiency targets or water efficiency gains in scarce area as identified by Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas. So that's a classic contextual water target. But to take that really to the next level of a context-based water target, there's really a few factors involved. And fundamentally what it is to create a specific time-bound objective that sets the desired outcome. So again, like I mentioned before with the science-based targets for greenhouse gases, think of the desired outcome first and then create specific time-bound objectives to achieve that outcome or contribute towards that outcome. And then again, it incorporates both the component that speaks to a company's water performance itself, so that could be within the operational facilities in a given basin, and the target needs to include a component that speaks to the basin's conditions. So that is, like I mentioned before, say scarcity or non-scarcity of water in a given location. So a context-based water target has 4 key criteria. The first would be utilizes science as a foundation for water targets. As I mentioned before, this is like one of the staples of the science-based targets and one of the staples of context-based water targets. And this is really one of the important changes that's being pushed with the context-based water target initiative. The other point, and again, this is just one of the unique factors of water, is that it needs to be addressing specific local challenges. So if there are no negative effects from certain conditions or water conditions in a given basin, then there is no target to be had. There needs to be negative environmental impacts that are being addressed on a local level, and then those need to be addressed with specific context-specific solutions. Another thing that context-based water target criteria needs to meet would be local and global policy objectives. So we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about how context-based water targets can really help in terms of, say, meeting SDGs or framing corporate targets among the SDG, specifically SDG 6 goals. And also, ideally, it relates to local policy objectives. And then again, the context-based water target needs to address the needs and perspectives of various stakeholders. And I think this one is really a given if or it is necessary to identify what are the key negative impacts in a given location. So criteria 2 and criteria 4, I mean, the way you understand the local nature of water challenges is by some engagement with local stakeholders of various types. So these, and I don't think any of these are going to be wildly new to any of the people in this webinar. I think that context-based water targets is probably best seen as a formalized structure to many of the ideas that people have been seeing and thinking about for a while. So in terms of a more theoretical sort of application of how a context-based water target could be applied, and this could be applied on a facility level or to a group of facilities within a given basin or even a corporate level. But I think it's good to envision a facility level just for the purpose of considering how to apply or approach a context-based water target. So first, definition of boundaries, of course, need to define a basin area, but also the operational boundaries of facilities within the basin or one facility. You also need to assess what is the scope, so time scope of a target, what are the water sources and what are the discharge locations, because say the sources for water for a given facility or the discharge location, that will define what is the place or basin or boundary limits where activities need to take place. Step 2 is simply understand both the site and the basin, so data collection. And the 2 classic parts of data collection are gathering information on water supply, on water demand, on water risk data, that's both present water risks and future scenarios. And then of course the most classic data collection, which is facility data, so water supply or water requirements for a facility, water withdrawal rates, water consumption rates, water discharge, permits and allocations. And then again, the third point would be data collection on identifying stakeholder concerns. Who are the other groups in the basin? What are their important priorities, and what do they see as major negative impacts operating in a given basin? So that would be sort of the 3 systems or approaches to getting a fully complete picture. So with that data, that informs the step 3, which is actually developing the targets. And that data would identify, first of all, identifying what is a given end state that is desired in a basin. So identifying the end state could be understanding all of the negative impacts that exist in a basin, and then seeing what would it take to eliminate all of those negative impacts. And that gives you the end state. And then, again, develop the target. It needs to be context-based and apply to each of the apply activities that respectively mitigate the each respective negative impact. So that's really, I mean, the target setting part. And then step 4 is monitoring. I think that we don't need to go into details there. Everyone knows where that goes. So that was a sort of high-level overview of the process of setting context-based water targets. I think that now we're more shifting gears to what is the business case, what is the rationale for embracing context-based targets. And really it comes down to 2 things in my mind. One is creating a bigger structured framework that has more actors pursuing the same goal in basins. So this, for example, aligning with SDGs. So one valuable aspect of context-based water targets is that it's a tool to incorporate SDGs into more than just a CSR report, but into like meaningful targets. So many businesses have increasingly been making commitments to SDG 6 in various ways, but sometimes, right, there's a commitment, but there's no demonstrable action, and that's not the corporate's fault. It's that it's very difficult to figure out a way to have a demonstrable action that backs, that approaches or mitigates certain SDGs. So context-based water targets can be seen as a tool to incorporate SDGs into specifically corporate targets. It's also a way to measure the contribution of a given corporate towards specific SDGs, so a way to back the commitment with measurements and really functional activities. And then, of course, it's also for a useful way to define what is a reasonable contribution of a business towards a given SDG. So I mean, that's another big question of, okay, we've made commitments to SDGs, SDG 6, and we want to mitigate all of the relevant aspects. But one question is, what do we start, and what is a reasonable amount? Like, what is a reasonable contribution? Because no corporate or any actor alone can effectively, achieve all of the SDGs. But what is a reasonable level of contribution for it? That's where context-based water target comes in. And overall, just for example, a variety of corporations that all embrace context-based water targets and frame it within the SDG framework. If they're operating within a given basin, then they will be moving towards a collective set of goals and all contributing their amount. And the reason that this is helpful is because it doesn't even necessarily require direct stakeholder engagement with everyone in the basin. There's still a framework that all actors in the basin are following. So really, that's the one big contribution of context-based water targets is a framework that aligns actions towards clear goals. The other one is that context-based water targets is more clearly gets at the root of water risk. So I think that many people have probably heard Paul say this before, that facility level activities, or say increasing operational efficiency, that's just a way of adapting to water risk, but that's not mitigating the root cause of water risk. So context-based water targets really gets at what is the root cause of water risk, and it exists within the context. It could be some sort of scarcity issue, it could be pollution issues, but when it comes down to it, in order to address the root cause, you need to be operating beyond the 4 walls of the facility or beyond the fence. So just to quickly run through how, or more details of why it mitigates water risk specifically, I mean, because it aligns with the priorities of the Basin Management Authority, because it's responding to specific local negative impacts on water resources, and because a context-based water target addresses multiple dimensions of water risk. This is a very big one. A lot of corporate targets it's quite difficult to create a system that addresses many dimensions of water risk. The classic one that we see would be some sort of volumetric water risk, but there are there's pollution aspects, there's scarcity aspects, there's human rights aspects to water risk for corporations in a given basin. So one of the useful aspects of context-based water targets is it allows a method for corporations to set one target, but the target is flexible in getting at all the different dimensions of water risk. Also, contributes to long-term water security. In addition to building equitable allocation methods, and it's rooted very much in creating some sort of system of allocation, and this is what I was referring to earlier in terms of the desired end state. It also provides the certainty with a clear endpoint, and that's what I mentioned before of multiple actors using the same framework to drive towards a specific end goal. And then it supports local global policy objectives. That's what I mentioned before with the SDGs. There could be much more local policy objectives as well, and ideally an effective context-based water target would include local policy objectives. So to give a quick example, because so far this has been fairly theoretical, but to try and make it a little more concrete, I think many people are familiar with the Mars targets, but we're going to approach it more in terms of discussion of how they used it to use it as an example of context-based water targets. So there's really 6 steps in the Mars water, for Mars to create the water target. The first 4, I think, count as fairly classic activities. Just to run through the example, I'll just start at the top, which is Mars first identified the total water footprint across their value chain. And I don't know how big the graphic is for everyone on screen, but each bubble is each step. So it starts with the total water across the value chain. Then they identified rain-fed water footprint. So rain-fed water, you can't necessarily create a reduction in rain-fed water. But then step 3 would be they identified irrigated water footprint across their value chain. So this is the amount of water in their footprint that they have the capacity to do something with, right? There's a potential for reduction. Then they followed up with, after identifying irrigated water footprint, they identified where is irrigated water in high water stress regions. This should sound very familiar to anyone who's talked about water risk assessment with WRI before. These are just the classic steps. Steps 5 and 6 are really where it becomes more context specific. So step 5 is rather than simply reduce irrigated water footprints in high stress regions, instead they identified what is a sustainable withdrawal rate for the basin where we have irrigated water and is high water stress. So they had a basin assessment of what is a sustainable withdrawal rate. So this is the classic context-based water targets. What is the desired end state? So what is the sustainable withdrawal rate on a basin level? And then taking the sustainable withdrawal rate on a basin level, they decided, made some assessments and assumptions about what is a fair allocation for Mars within this entire basin. So this gets into some more details of fair share, and I won't go into the details of how they calculated it, but this is one of the sort of the crux of context-based water targets that we'll get into in a bit. But basically, they had an allocation of this is a reasonable allocation for Mars given the way they're operating in this basin, and they're not going to exceed that allocation. So once they've established what is a fair share and an objective to not exceed that allocation, now Mars has a long-term target, which is to have 0 water withdrawals that exceeds a sustainable withdrawal rate in a water stress region, with irrigated water footprint. So that's the long-term target. The short-term target ended up being have the current excess withdrawal rate. So that hopefully is sort of a quick overview, and I think it's a familiar example, but a quick overview of how a context-based water target can be applied at a global level or at a corporate level. It could also be applied at an asset level or a collection of assets within a given basin. But so that's sort of an overview of the approach. To move on, I think there was a lot of steps, a lot of feedback that we got in Stockholm. Paul and Emilio and I were all there at CEO Water Mandate, and basically kind of boils down to maybe 5 major next steps or 5 priorities that need to be established in moving forward with context-based water target initiatives. So first of all, though, as Emilio mentioned before, there's very strong support for context-based water targets overall. There's a lot of question about the details, but there's very strong support for the initiative. The major next steps would be, one, and I was alluding to this in the Mars example, it's important to identify what a fair share is or what a reasonable allocation is for a given company. And this is something that is necessary to have a very strong context-based water target, but it's also something that there is no established methodology for. So establishing what is a fair share of use for a given company or a given sector within sustainable withdrawal limits, that's a big question mark that needs to be sort of answered, or we need some methodologies to answer it. Another one is the example I gave, the Mars example, is very focused on withdrawal rates, and that's a very reasonable stance for Mars to take because they're mostly an agricultural, agriculture is the biggest part of their footprint. But on the other hand, many different companies or businesses will have different priorities, right? Withdrawal won't necessarily be the highest priority. So what is needed is to develop a common definition of context-based water targets and guidance that can be applied for all different types of context-based water targets. Right now, it's very, right now, the volumetric game, I think, is something a lot of people understand, but there are other aspects of negative water impacts that require more guidance. Third, context-based water targets are science-based. I think that we've kind of hammered that point home enough, but it also needs to include the socio-political elements. This is something that the current framework includes to some degree, but there needs to be more information and guidance on this. So for example, we heard one story about a facility that had done a hydrogeological assessment of what is the sustainable withdrawal rate for the facility and within that given basin, and use that to say, okay, we are below the sustainable withdrawal rate. They did a basin-wide assessment, and they did their survey, and they talked to the hydrogeologists and said, okay, we're within the sustainable withdrawal rates, great. Seems good, but then an activist NGO comes along. They also have a hydrogeologist do an assessment of sustainable withdrawal rates in a given basin, and their assessment was very much that this is not that the facility and the basin is far exceeding the sustainable withdrawal rates. So that example is both those talk to their hydrogeologists and work on developing a sustainable withdrawal formula, but sometimes the scientific and evidence-based stances may conflict. And this is one of the big reasons why the socio-political element needs to be included. It's not enough for a corporation to have a science-based target, but not go and engage stakeholders externally within the basin. So really, it needs to include all factors, so social, political, and science-based. And this also probably indicates that how to define a sustainable withdrawal is still very much a question that needs to be resolved. Fourth, and this is something that WRI is interested in working on, is some sort of system to link corporate goals and asset level targets. This is a big issue. Context-based water targets they're very applicable on a facility level. I used the Mars example because it's a really good example of a corporate goal, but making the linkage between a corporate goal that is applicable everywhere and asset level targets that are very contextually based, that's a very difficult connection to make, and that hasn't quite been filled out. And then the fifth response that was really heard strongly in Stockholm was that this is very advanced. As I alluded to at the very beginning, this is leading practice for a few leading companies in leading sectors. This is not something that every company can get on board with right away, especially if they're very early on in the water stewardship journey. So in addition to filling out the context-based water targets and more information and guidance on how to do it, it also needs to be placed into a much broader framework, larger corporate water stewardship journey, you could say, so that companies of different levels and different experiences can sort of be onboarded into where is appropriate, because this is not something that you could go to a company and explain to them corporate water or context-based water targets if they haven't even done basic water risk assessments. There's a lot of steps in this process. This is only one step in the larger process. I think that's good. These 5 points are really the main 5 points, and I think the crux of the information that we drew out of Stockholm. I'll stop now, and I want to open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin. So folks, just a quick reminder, you can type your questions into the question box or raise your hand to ask a question. So I'll just pause first to see if anyone on the line has any pressing questions, either on clarification or applications.
Can I just add to Colin's point? This is Emilio, by the way.
Yeah.
I think in the Mars example, clearly they had an availability or allocation mindset in terms of trying to define what that looked like for that site that they were talking about. But obviously, there's also a quality aspect of it, Colin, that people need to be aware of. That it's availability as well as quality, and things like nutrient loads and suspended solids or connectivity and things that are standard pollutants are obviously a factor to context-based targeting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, and I think this is a good point, that an inherent issue with the example I gave, but also something that context-based water targets, the initiative, is trying to sort out more, is that people have a very good handle on the volumetric game, right? We've got this covered. They know that. But yes, there's those water quality aspects. There is human right to water aspects. There is, or another example would be, how do you track corporate water engagement activities or collective action on the ground if that's what's needed within a given context or within a given basin. There are many other dimensions that are not simply a withdrawal element. Completely right on that. And that, I think, is where is kind of on point two. There needs to be more guidance for how to apply context-based water targets, not in a withdrawal scenario, but in all the other scenarios. That's really what needs to be kind of filled out. Thank you, though. Very good point.
So Colin, looking at the list of people who are on the line here from the CCG and the Aqueduct Alliance, we have a good spread of sectors and types of companies. So for example, agriculture, food, health, entertainment, hospitality. Some of the companies on the line are producing products, some are providing services. Do you have any, and this could be for you, Paul or Emilio, kind of any comments in terms of what might be nuanced based on the sector of the company setting the context-based target?
Yeah, I mean, a nuance that I think is always important to highlight is to think about this across the value chain, to hone in on where water is most material to the business, and that is very sector specific, right? Some organizations have a huge dependency on water in their sourcing of raw materials, other it's in their supply chain, others it's in their operations, others it's in their markets which they serve. So understanding where your dependency and impact is greatest is a really good first step to understanding where you might want to engage at a more local level and setting more meaningful targets.
I think I would also add that great point that, I mean, there's so many different sectors and different types of audience on the line. I think one of the goals with context-based water targets, and this is kind of what Emilio was almost getting at too, with there's so many different types of negative water impacts. But one of the goals of context-based water targets is to be able to roll all of these impacts together, which ideally creates a flexible framework that any sector, that any industry can use. That is the objective. And by creating a flexible framework, but also having some sort of standardization, creates collective action towards that everyone is moving towards some specific aim. So that's the goal. I would say it's not always achieved, and it's definitely need more pilot studies, more examples. But ideally, yes, this would be applicable for any sector.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions from the audience and participants? Oh, we have a hand. That's great. Just bear with us as we unmute your line here. There we go.
Vetri, go ahead. Can you hear us, Vetri?
I believe we've unmuted you through the webinar, but maybe check your local.
Maybe. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, it's Vetri from Kimberly Clark. So the question I have was that on the context-based water goals, right? So, for example, a basin that we as a company are going to lead and try to look for data, finding some local data is one of the biggest challenges we run into. So how do WRI or the other people can help, like bringing other companies together to find the local basin data so you can have a similar hydrogeologist data to know what should be a sustainable water consumption?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question, Vetri. So what we, along with the other organizations involved in this initiative are doing now is we're looking to engage some of the modeling organizations that have existing basin level models that are already built with data that can be run. So, I know, Vetri, you've worked with Desdatis from the Netherlands. There's also the Stockholm Environmental Institute, SCI. These are groups that have developed basin level models and have very localized, granular, robust data for them. So instead of going out and trying to rebuild these models, we want to start by looking at what basins around the world already have an existing model and existing data that's robust, where we might be able to start. So as soon as we have an idea of what those basins are, then, through the CCG, through the Aqueduct Alliance, we plan to, shine light on what those locations are and try to convene organizations around places where, immediate action is needed. And at the same time, there is a reputable organization that could provide data at the local scale.
That's good, thank you. So, another question I have is that on the context-based water goal, is it always the sustainable water consumption, or do we also look at the water basin health itself?
I think it's both. I think that the basin health is going to be greatly contingent upon the sustainable withdrawals, and like Emilio mentioned, also the water quality. I would also highlight the state of natural infrastructure, right, with the forested areas, the riparian corridors, the state of the stream corridors. So it very much takes a holistic approach, looking at overall basin health. If basin health is low, the key is, okay, what's driving those impacts on basin health? Is it a quantity issue? Is it quality? If it's quality, what type of water quality issues? Is it heavy metals? Is it nutrients? Is it sedimentation? So it really, I think Colin mentioned in his presentation, it really tries to get at root cause, right, of water-related risks and ensure that the investments that companies are making and the changes and performance over time are aligning with and addressing those local situations.
Thanks, yeah. Thanks, Paul.
You bet.
Thanks for the question. We're close to the hour, but we could probably squeeze in another question, or if folks want to add them into the chat, we can always grab them as a follow-up. Yeah. As you're considering your questions, I just want to make sure to add that, of course, all of the presenters today are available for follow-up questions and conversations. So you can always reach them through me if you're not sure how to access Paul or Colin. But we're always happy to continue this dialogue in a more company-specific context if that's helpful. There we go. Okay, well, we're on the hour and I don't see any more raised hands. Oh, Vitri, did you have another question? No. Okay, maybe raise your hand for you. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. Okay, and thank you, Emilio, for your time and sharing your insights, and to Colin, Paul, and Leah for your preparation and presentation. So thanks, everyone, and we'll speak to you again soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.